Within that, there was this quote that came back to me that I'd heard a while back, and I thought it was really fitting, especially given the invitation we extended to Dr. Greg Ozark to come and speak on the opening night. This is a line from the good Dr. Stanley Hauerwas, who's known to not pull any punches, right? He says this: the intellectual and moral seriousness of medical education compared to seminary education, I think, can be attributed to a set of cultural presuppositions that are crucial for how we understand the training of students for medicine and for the ministry. Quite simply, no one believes in our day that an inadequately trained priest or pastor might damage their salvation, but people do believe an inadequately trained doctor can hurt them. Thus, people are much more concerned about who their doctor may be than who is their priest or pastor. That such is the case, of course, indicates that no matter how seriously we may think of ourselves as Christians, we may well be living lives that betray our conviction that God matters. So you just kind of followed that all the way through. He's saying, like, we put tons and tons of emphasis, and we heard this from Greg, right, on medical training and the medical profession, because we know doctors can hurt us if they're bad at what they do. And so it's just interesting that we don't apply the same kind of scrutiny sometimes to those who we're actually entrusting the care of our souls to. So, of course, this has already been touched on here and there, but as we wade directly into these conversations and strategies in the area of training those who will lead the church, we're treading on ground which for most of the history of Western Christianity has been occupied by institutions of Christian higher education, especially seminaries. So it's probably even worth asking, is this even a conversation for us? Isn't it a conversation that maybe is better left to those who work in the arena of theological education? So I'm going to try to convince you that not only is this a conversation for us as pastors and church leaders, but that we ought to be leading it. We ought to be leading it. So I don't think it's hard to understand why we would ask that question. It's because over the course of time and on account of certain cultural realities, churches and seminaries were able to exist somewhat independently of one another. Our cultural context made this possible. It's exactly what Todd was talking to us about yesterday, how 40 or 50 years ago, church planting, church ministry required little more than franchising or branding. Right? You could just kind of set up shop and people would come based on what kind of church you were posturing yourself as. Their purview was really meeting the religious needs of the communities in which they were and the people of those geographies. And within that sort of system, those who sought to lead these churches were then sent, or more often just individually decided to go to professional training schools to receive an academically credentialed degree, which could then help them secure a paid position in a local church. That was the system that was really in operation, has been in operation. In other words, for a good long while now, the church has essentially outsourced the training of pastors to seminaries. And we're all here, I suspect, because in some way, shape, or form, we find that particular model lacking, problematic, or at least insufficient in some way. So alongside the rest of what we've been talking about these last few days, a final important question I think for us to consider is this. As local churches seek to reclaim a more central role in the formation of equipping future church leaders, how should we then understand and relate to the arena of theological education? That's really the question that's kind of at the crux of what we want to talk about this morning. So here's how I'm approaching that question. 3 things. Like a good evangelical pastor, I got 3 things. First, I want to talk briefly about what I see as the primary historical backdrop to this question, which I'm going to refer to as the missiological crisis of Christendom, and I'll unpack that. And then here's what I want to make a plea for us. I'm going to make this plea today for the recovery of something that I think we lost within that crisis, namely a vision of church ministry as theological leadership. Church ministry as theological leadership. And then from there, I think we'll be in a better position to sort of take a big swing at this question of how we should be thinking about the intersection of church-based training of emerging leaders and the arena of theological education, how those things can begin to come together. Okay, so hopping into this deal about Christendom as a missiological crisis for the church. In a group as sort of diverse as this, and I don't know everybody's background and where you're coming from, I don't know what you think of when you hear that term Christendom. So I'm going to offer up my definition and just trust that you can let's just use this for the purposes of our talk, and then if you want to argue with me about it later, we can argue about it later. So here's my definition. Christendom is a time or culture in which the Christian religion is the officially endorsed religion of the state, or in which Christian sentimentality, things like morals and standards and values, traditions, play a major role in the shaping of that time or culture. Right, so this is primarily, you have a European expression of Christendom where you have state churches, and then you have a more North American expression of Christendom where we don't really have state churches, but Christianity has been the sort of de facto religion of our context and culture. So we're going to do a 50,000-foot flyby on this, just because that's what we have to do. So Christendom is something that came into existence in and about the 4th century, when over the course of time, Christianity came to be the officially endorsed religion of the Roman Empire. And then Christianity was then primarily spread through the expanse of Rome via its conquest of other lands and peoples. That's how Christianity moved, primarily, in the West. Various iterations of Christendom came into expression all over Europe, and then were carried over here to North America. And so, like I said, Christendom for us has never taken the form of a state church, but it's been what we were born out of. So within Christendom, here's the kind of crux of the issue, is that citizenry and religious identity are essentially one and the same. And this creates all sorts of problems for us. The most fundamental of these problems is what I would call and this is a great phrase to get tongue-tied on, the normalizing of nominality. What Christendom does is it normalizes nominality, Christian nominality. As the social identity of the church is relocated from the center, from the margins of society to the very center of its power structures, what we see is a loss of a vision of God as a missionary God, the church as a missionary people, and Christians as missionary disciples. We lose that vision. That's why I'm calling this a missiological crisis, something that's intrinsic to how we should be understanding who God is, and God's, the identity of purpose of the local church, and then what it actually means to be a disciple. We lose the missionary texture of all of those things within this Christendom sort of space. So this is why my doctoral mentor, Wilbert Schenck, was always fond of saying, Western Christendom is Christianity without mission. Western Christendom is Christianity without mission. So obviously there's innumerable ways in which we could kind of go there, but given the specific focus of what we're looking at here, the place of theological education in the formation of church leaders, what I want to suggest there's two primary effects of this missiological crisis of normalizing nominality that we need to have in view. Realities that have marked the landscape of American Christianity in fundamental ways over the last 250 years or so. The first effect is this reality, and again, Todd spoke of this, of a huge population of people who, by virtue of their identity as Americans, also default to identifying as Christians. This is just what happens when you take the bar of Christian identity and move it down to the level of being born. Right? This is what Christendom does. What does it mean to be a Christian? To be born here. Like, that's just kind of our religious identity. So what we see taking shape over the course of American Christianity is sort of this proliferation then of local churches among a seemingly ever-expanding population of people for whom church attendance is just a part of life. That's just what you do. It's part and parcel of what it means to be a good American. You go to church. Still, I spent a year and a half as a pastor on staff at a church in Memphis. And and I'm a Midwest guy. I grew up here in the Midwest, so this is very odd to me that I went down there, and as you met people, they would ask you 3 questions. Well, the first question was either, what do you do or where do you live? Those were sort of interchangeable. And the second question was always, what's your church? I mean, and that was just normal. Like, so it was really weird for me coming out of the Midwest. And it was part of your social identity. And so even if you never went to church, even if you never attended a church service, you still identified a church because it helped people to locate you, like who you were. So, so this is still sort of alive and well in different parts of the country. right? So the question driving the expansion of the church in that sort of a situation is decidedly not a missionary question. That's not the question. It's a market question in that context. In short, and hopefully it goes without saying that this results from like a broad confluence of things, but we see the local church take on the identity primarily of a vendor of religious goods and services. Here's this statement from Daryl Guter. In the Christendom mode, the primary beneficiaries are the members of the church. The church is basically inwardly oriented, focused on itself and its members and on their savedness. Its activities concentrate on the mediation and maintenance of their salvation, along with the preservation of the institution itself. I mean, so do you feel that? I mean, like, this is all part and parcel of my growing up and my experience of Christianity in the Midwest and other places. I'm hoping you can kind of like, even if you want to like nitpick, with certain things here, that we can all kind of like resonate with that sort of thing that's happened in the history of Christianity here in the U.S. So if we see what he's saying here, it's that in Christendom, a Christendom model of the church, the identity of the church is rooted not in a missionary witness to or engagement with our surrounding context, but in service to an identifiable and decidedly nominal Christian populace. That's what Guter is on about here. And given that mode of being, the priorities of church leadership came to then center on two functions: pastoral care and teaching. So those are the sort of the functions of church leadership that made that iteration of church sustainable and go within Christendom: pastoral care and teaching. And of course, okay, so don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm going to be really clear. These are indispensable dimensions of local church leadership. Right? So it's not down with pastoral care and teaching. These are indispensable. But often in their emphasis, what ends up missing in the life of our local churches is any substantive and core commitment to the equipping of Christians as missionary disciples. That sort of gets lost. It's just sort of about tending to the people who are circling into our local churches out of their American sort of identity. The upshot of this is a skewed understanding and expression of the purpose of the local church, which results then in what I would call the atrophy of missionary muscles and instincts. Those things just atrophy in the life of our congregations. So that's the first dynamic that I think we need to name in asking this question about the relationship between theological education and the life of the local church. Like, we have to sort of begin with that as a backdrop. However, as we seek to answer that question, it must take shape around a recovery of the church's fundamentally missional nature and life and the witness of the local church. So here's the second dynamic. The second dynamic we need to pay attention to flows really directly out of this first one, and it has to do with the systems and the structures that emerge then to support churches and train pastors within this sort of Christendom paradigm. So the two things go hand in hand. So as these churches popped up and grew all over the country, there was increasing amounts of need for trained clergy to run them, right? It's just a simple supply and demand sort of thing. So with all the demand that existed, denominations began to create schools to supply the clergy. Denominations and, just independent seminaries, theological schools popped up as well. And these schools, given the landscape and the expressed need of these churches, they built their programs around training for the priorities that I named above, right? Pastoral care and teaching. This is our cultural context. This is the way that churches are serving the people in those communities. And so as seminaries and theological institutions, these are the way in which we need to shape our curriculum, build our programs, and all that kind of stuff. So within this era, the demand was for church leaders who could help people feel cared for and then intellectually well-fed. And accordingly, seminaries took shape around supplying for that demand. This feeds into two aspects of the missiological crisis that I'm suggesting we're facing. In the first place, we now have this sort of fixed ecology of relationship between local churches and theological education that's predicated on a fundamentally non-missionary framework for understanding and being the church. So we have this embedded ecology now, right, of like churches are used to functioning like this, seminaries and schools are used to training clergy for the function of these local churches, right? So we have this embedded ecology between these two. And then we also see the rise of parachurch organizations, global missionary agencies, and many other kinds of groups and projects that I would put under this broad banner of mission societies or something, domestic mission societies, which sort of unwittingly then undercut this fundamentally missionary identity of the church. So this lands us in a world of hurt when it comes to the kind of cracking and crumbling of Christendom. right? As the church and the Christian faith are de-centered from society and pushed to the margins, all of a sudden, now we have an ecology that exists between local churches and seminaries that's fundamentally non-missionary. We also have a division within the body of Christ that we have these churches that serve primarily a pastoral and teaching function. And along the side, we had to know what there were those who just had instinctively missionary impulses, and they went over here and created all these other institutions and parachurch organizations and societies. And so now it's a matter of trying to get those things back together as well. And this is the world we live in. Like, these are the challenges before us, is like reuniting these things. The second aspect of this dynamic is financial, and I'm sure this is not going to be news to anybody in the room, even if it's not affecting you personally. You're just going to know about this, I would suspect. One of the primary things that underwrote our inherited systems of training for the ministry of the local church was a social reality that made the financial model of seminaries viable for pastors in training. Right, so the financial model of training of clergy was predicated on the reality that were all these jobs that were available. That day is long gone. That day is like long gone. The average seminary grad is coming out with $50,000 or more of student loan debt, with rapidly diminishing opportunity to move into a vocational situation that can actually help them tackle that. So just when we're being reawakened to the need for missionary kinds of leadership and forms of the church, as Christendom crumbles, we're finding those systems that we've built to produce church leaders not only structurally incapable of producing those kinds of leaders, but then we're stuck with a mode of operation that's dependent on patterns of student debt that cripple the ability of those leaders to act missionally, even if they could. Okay, so let me just sort of say that again, right? So we're kind of tied up over here in this ecology of a system of relating local church and theological education that's fundamentally non-missionary, which is a problem in and of itself. And we're seeing, though, a variety of schools, many of whom associate with Missio Alliance, which is fantastic, trying to take the reality of the church seriously and saying, we have to start equipping people in ways that are much more cognizant of the missionary function of the church and the need for church leaders. Except we're also saddled with a financial model that the only way people can get that education is typically to take on $50,000 or $1,000 more worth of debt, so that once you get out, try being a missionary with $50,000 of debt around your neck. It's just really hard, right? Okay, and there's a lot to this. There's a lot to this. So I'm being simplistic a little bit for the sake of time and ease of conversation, but I'll just acknowledge there's a lot to this. And it all serves to illustrate what I have in mind when I'm talking about the missiological crisis of Christendom. It serves as a necessary backdrop to two things, to both really being able to, insightfully assess the situation we find ourselves in today, as well as developing an imagination for the way forward. We've got to sort of come to grips with these things. One way of expressing this for our purpose this week is that the missiological crisis that we're facing has created a breach in the arena of the life of the local church, so that we think of theological education and church ministry as two fairly independent worlds. And I want to submit to you that in the economy of God's kingdom, these cannot be seen as discrete categories. They can't. But they're integral parts of a single vocational calling. This is what I'm calling church ministry as theological leadership. And if you like, we can say church ministry is theological leadership for mission. Would maybe even be a way to extend that a little bit, to put a finer point on it. Just before I press into that, though, let me go ahead and name my primary fear when I use that phrase. Okay, church ministry is theological leadership. My fear is that when I say it, what you're going to hear in saying that, or anything that follows, is essentially me saying we need pastors to know and communicate more information about God. Okay, that's my fear, is that that's what we'll hear, and it's way off the mark of what I have in mind. It's not what I mean. So if that's what you hear, we're going to have to chalk it up to a failure on my part to communicate effectively what I'm after here, and you can just trust me that I had something else in mind and we can figure it out later. So that said, let me try to unpack this a bit for us, as it might apply specifically to the residencies as training vehicles for church leadership. It's going to be another three things. So, seeing church ministry as theological leadership calls us, number one, to root training for church leadership in the character and mission of God. Seeing church ministry as theological leadership calls us to root our training for church leadership in the character and mission of God. By this, I quite simply mean that we need to get back to a place of considering how our sense of the identity, purpose, and practice of the local church is rooted in and thus reflects what we believe to be true about God's own character and God's mission in the world. And this sort of theological work and orientation was essentially irrelevant within Christendom. This wasn't a standard operating procedure. This just wasn't on the radar for most of our people. Church ministry was mainly a matter of what I would call cultural pragmatism, with our sense of the general viability of the church intact. Church is a viable entity. We just need to know how to make it go. We don't have to really think about what it is. It just is, and we're just going to figure out how to make it work. We simply evaluate the cultural context and then adapt church structures and practices to accommodate that particular landscape, right? So that's the sort of default position for church leaders as they think about where we root our understanding of the nature, purpose, and practice of the local church. Okay, so there's something I think that should strike us as very good about that. Right and good. So even when I say it, when I write it, I'm like, it kind of seems like there's something really good about that I don't want to lose. And what I think it is that we have to be careful to note this difference between what I would call true incarnational witness, which is a fundamentally theological posture, between that and a drive to mere cultural relevance, which is just a more sociological posture. And again, I'm not saying one is good and one is bad. I'm more thinking about an ordering here of our priorities.
Can you repeat just those two sentences?
Yeah, so we have to be careful about the difference between a truly incarnational witness, which I'm saying is a theological posture towards how we understand the church, and a drive towards just mere cultural relevance, which is a more sociological posture. So the first prioritizes the identity and agency of God and God's mission in the world. The second prioritizes our own agency and sense of mission in the world. So we just get these things back to front. Or we might say it this way: in framing church ministry as theological leadership, the first question of local church leaders is not, how can we thrive in this place among these people? But in light of what we know of God and the nature of God's mission in the world, how will we understand, shape, and communicate our own identity? So you just see the difference in the beginning place. Okay, over here, it's like, I'm going to begin with, what do I understand, believe, and know is true about God? And then how do I work out implications for what that means for my ecclesiology, my understanding and practice of the church? Then the next question is, and how do we contextualize that? What does all that look like here, in this time, in this place, for our sense of call here, as opposed to looking first and primarily at our cultural context and saying, well, how can we be effective here? Right? So it's just different prioritizations. Questions of contextualization are crucial, but in moving past this missiological crisis of Christendom, I want to submit that they need to follow rather than precede how people are trained to lead local churches. The theological thing has to come first. So here's a question for us. Here's all of us are going to I'm trying to think about how to just boil this down to its application to thinking about a residency program. Here's the question: in and through our residency program, how will we train future church leaders to root their understanding of the church and their own ministry philosophy, including how those things translate into structures and practices in the character and mission of God? Okay, can you just sort of absorb that in a summary sort of form? As you think about residency programs, I'm saying it's in terms of embracing church ministry as theological leadership for mission, I'm going to submit that it's imperative to ask this question about how are we going to help residents to do that, to root their understanding of the church and how that understanding translates into their own ministry philosophy, structures and practices in the identity and character and mission of God, as opposed to merely cultural effectiveness or something like that. Okay, so second thing, that was the first one. The second thing is this: create space for theological encounter. Embracing church ministry as theological leadership, I'm suggesting, means creating space for theological encounter. I'm guessing we all intuitively know how important this is, and I'm sure we can all think of encounters that we've had with other church leaders who had enormous talent and capacity and competency in areas that made them extremely effective, at least in one sense of that word, as church leaders. And these people may have also had exemplary aspects to their character. But we all have experienced this. There's something special that marks those people that we meet who have truly encountered God. These are different people. And this is what I think we need to be thinking about in terms of the training of future church leaders. We're not just after creating more technically qualified people to fill roles. I don't think. We want to advance the ministry of those who have truly encountered God and allow ministry to flow out of that encounter. Okay? So this is tricky because the minute you try to manufacture it, you sabotage it. The minute we try to manufacture someone encountering God, you can rest assured it's not going to happen. Theological encounter just doesn't work in any sort of programmatized or systematized way. It's almost always unexpected, often unwanted, but in every single instance transformative. It's Abraham's call to leave his home. It's Jacob's wrestling match. It's Moses in the burning bush. It's Mary's visit from Gabriel. It's Paul's encounter on the road to Damascus. It's Peter's dream at the home of Cornelius. It's John's revelation while imprisoned on an island. And it's what we get from Luke in Acts 4. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. And that's what we want, right? I mean, we would hope to see the flourishing of these kinds of leaders through our residency programs. And again, we know we can't manufacture these kinds of experiences, but I want to suggest that in seeking to equip folks for church ministry as theological leadership, it's still nevertheless incumbent upon us to consider how we might create space for that to happen. Can't make it happen. We might be able to do some certain things that create space where it might happen. So here's the question then, just like I did above for the first one. In and through our residency program, how will we create space for emerging church leaders to encounter God in ways that no other dimension of education, coaching, or apprenticeship could ever duplicate? How will we create that kind of space? Last one. In terms of embracing church ministry as theological leadership for mission, I think it means that we see the qualities of the kingdom and the fruit of the Spirit as the primary criteria for evaluating leadership development. See the qualities of the kingdom and the fruits of the Spirit as the primary criteria for evaluating leadership development. In some ways, I think this final area is probably the one that could pose the most trouble for us. I say that because on one hand, it calls for a relational proximity and a sort of informed, wisdom-laden subjectivity on the part of those looking to raise up future leaders. It calls for a relational proximity and a sort of like subjectivity on my part that hopefully is informed and laden with wisdom, spiritual wisdom, to do this. And on the other hand, it calls for incredible amounts of transparency and patience and the release of leadership ego on the part of those who are looking to lead churches. This is a tall order. In short, nearly everything in our culture, as well as in our current approaches to leadership formation, run counter to this dimension of seeing church ministry as theological leadership. And so when I say the qualities of the kingdom, just make sure we're on the same page here. I'm thinking of Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and 7. And when I say fruits of the Spirit, I'm thinking of Paul's teaching in Galatians 5. It should strike us as quite incredible, don't you think, that these are realities that we often call our communities to seek after and reflect, but they're seldom, if ever, seen as the standards by which we evaluate the health and vitality of those who lead our churches. Now, I don't know if that's your experience. This is my experience. That these are qualities and characteristics of life in Christ that are easy for us to preach about, teach about, expect from our congregations. But I don't know that I've ever been evaluated as like someone who thought he wanted to help lead the church based on those criteria. So just to go ahead and join in with my friends Todd and Keith, who both referenced their indebtedness to Dallas Willard for much of what they shared, let me reference what I'm trying to argue for here is what Dallas called a curriculum for Christ-likeness. Dallas called this a curriculum for Christ-likeness. So imagine, if you will, a curriculum offered either by a seminary or a local church, doesn't matter, which had in view the development of leaders as those who would exhibit in increasing measure the marks of the kingdom: meekness and a hungering and thirsting for righteousness, peacemaking and rejoicing in persecution. Love for enemies and radical generosity are the fruits of the Spirit. Love for all, joy in all circumstances, peace amid trials, patience in suffering, kindness to strangers, goodness despite personal gain, faithfulness when wronged, gentleness to aggressors, and self-control against disordered impulses. Can you imagine a seminary program that used those things as its measurable outcomes? Probably not. But if we're honest with each other, I wonder if it's really all that much easier to imagine those sorts of things being the primary criteria that we might use in our local church contexts, even. But still, I'm hoping and praying that some of us will take up precisely that challenge as we think about how we shape our residency programs and evaluate the progress of those who participate. So here's how I think we ask this final question. In and through our residency program, how will we hold up the values of the kingdom and the fruit of the Spirit as primary theological markers for the formation of emerging church leaders? In and through our residency program, how will we hold up the values of the kingdom and the fruit of the Spirit as primary theological markers for the formation of emerging church leaders? Just in case you missed it, I want to go ahead and point out how insanely non-novel all of this is. Truthfully, when I say that we need to reclaim church ministry as theological leadership, it's basically code for I'd like us to take another look at Jesus and his engagement with the disciples. Rooting our training in the character and mission of God, creating space for theological encounter, pointing toward the kingdom and the work of the Holy Spirit as those things which ought to mark those who live under the lordship of Christ. This is all the stuff of Jesus' ministry and the approach that he seemed committed to seeing God's kingdom advance in the world. Okay, to wrap this up, I'm just going to offer a few contentious comments, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. On what I see as that's the vision, I think, right? As we look out on the horizon of the church and the task before us, I'm trying to name the realities, the backgrounds, the things that have shaped where we are today. I'm trying to name a vision for what I think we need to reclaim in the lives of our local churches. Church ministry as theological leadership for a mission. I'm going to try to be practical here in terms the actual title of this talk about bridging theological education in the local church, because where we are is we have this bifurcation. We have our theological training schools over here, and we have local churches over here, and we need to think about what are the sort of shifts that are going to need to take place if we're going to see those two worlds begin to sort of come together a little bit into the future. So these are shifts that I think there's work to be done on both sides of the equation, okay? The local church side and the seminary side. So nobody gets a pass. The first is this: a shift from seeing church ministry as something that leaders are prepared for and start seeing it as something that leaders are prepared in. The first shift is a shift from seeing church ministry as something that church leaders are prepared for and start seeing it as something that leaders are prepared in. This is primarily an issue of our orientation to time. Part of Mark's video presentation was in medieval period or whatever. Everyone lived for 35 years. 17 years of those 35 were spent in training. So I think this means that both seminaries and churches will need to take a longer, and it might even be best to say lifelong, posture towards leadership formation, right? So, let's just sort of be done with hey, I did an MDiv. I'm good to go, right? I'll go to a conference every now and then, pick up a book. I think we chuck it. quite honestly, and say, dude, if we're gonna step into the world of local church leadership, let's just embrace the fact that like I'm gonna have to undergo a process of lifelong formation and figure out how to make that happen. The needs are so great, the pressure's so strong, and the cultural currents shifting so rapidly. I think churches and seminaries alike will need to begin developing an imagination for intentionally designed patterns of formation and development for church leaders that are lifelong. So that's the first kind of shift. Number two, a shift in seeing who is a candidate for training. Again, I think this is a shift on the local church side, and I think this is a shift on the seminary side. On the church side of the equation, I think we need a re-engagement with the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. And alongside things like residencies for those who are discerning a call to vocational ministry, I'm going to submit that we need to begin developing an imagination for models of training and mobilizing the laity as missionary disciples. Okay, and there's two parts of this. Part of it, I think, has to do with honoring the fact that God calls people, not only calls people, but people just find themselves in all kinds of vocational spaces. Right? And so it's incumbent then upon the local church, I think, to develop an imagination for how are we equipping these people to understand their particular vocational spaces and callings as primary spaces for the furtherance of the mission of God. Okay? And cards on the table, I'm not a Kuyperian, so that's not what I mean when I say this. I don't mean let's infiltrate society, all the like powerful cultural spaces of society, and like just Christianize it from the top down. I just mean helping people in our congregation who are teachers, lawyers, doctors, garbage collectors, understand and receive their vocational space as an opportunity for the furtherance of God's mission in the world. I don't know about you. I've never been a part of a local church that does that. By the way, Jeff, I love our local church. So but we don't do that. So that's part of it, and then there's this other like non-vocational part of it that I think is just how are we helping the people in our congregations understand their very identity in Christ as that of a missionary disciple. I mean, and it's got a vocational part to that, but it's also got like this rest of our lives part to it. And like, how are we training and mobilizing people to be missionaries among their networks and neighborhoods and all that kind of stuff? Okay, on the seminary side is this. I think that we need to move beyond a paradigm of preparing professionals for a given industry. So this day of like, there's just this anonymous, not really like, large Christian industry, church industry that seminaries can exist to prepare church leaders for. I think they have a significant role to play in that, right? But I think that what increasingly seminaries are going to have to begin thinking about is going to entail, significant revisions in financial models, curriculum design, delivery methods, and even the kind of faculty that we look to who can provide the sort of training that isn't just about ministry professionals, right? Vocational pastoral people, but how do seminaries actually leverage the rich resources that they have at their disposal on behalf of the local church in its task of preparing people for their own vocational callings and as missionary disciples in their context. Last one, and then we'll be done with this, a shift in our attitude towards accreditation. And this is kind of a money issue. And again, it's a shift that has to take place on both the church side of the equation and on the seminary side of the equation. Here's the deal. All of our major accrediting bodies took shape in the cocoon of Christendom. So edit and tweak as they might like, they're so ensconced in non-missionary modes of thinking and operation, signaled most strongly by an umbilical cord-like connection to state and federal government, that I really just have no confidence in their capacity to serve the long-range purposes of the church, given the time that we live in. We're seeing happen is essentially a lowering of the bar. So there is movement within accrediting bodies like ATS, but what we're really seeing is kind of a lowering of a bar rather than its wholesale relocation, which is what we really need. So I think seminaries need to loosen their ties to ATS and similar accrediting bodies, but doing so will likely only come predicated on a new kind of demand coming from churches for models of education that require alternative forms of accreditation. That was kind of a lot of words. You get that? But like, the only way that we're going to see change, I would suspect, on the part of seminaries who are beholden to a particular model of ministry because they've been supplying clergy for a particular model of the church, is if we create a new kind of demand amongst our churches and say to seminaries, hey, like, help us prepare leaders for this kind of ministry under this kind of a vision, and let's talk about what it would look like to accredit just a completely alternative kind of theological education, something that's far more ecclesial than we know today. Okay, my last statement on this issue of accreditation, and to try to pull all of this together, I'm going to give one last final word to my doctoral mentor, Wilbert Schenck, who said this. Some scholars have argued that a touchstone in the formation of the New Testament canon was whether a document helped to prepare the disciple community for suffering, even unto death. A corollary for a missionary church in the 21st century may well be that only that theology which prepares the church to bear witness to Jesus Christ, even at the price of death, will be accredited. So within the spaces of our local churches, or within the spaces of our theological seminaries, and certainly within the space of how those two relate, this is sort of the imagination I'm hoping that can kind of fund and fuel a new mode of being and new modes of relating that we desperately need, models of theological formation that bring together the resources of the local church, especially its context, and the resources of theological schools and seminaries, and say we have to develop a new imagination for how we're preparing leaders to face the challenges the church is facing today. Good luck to us, right? Yeah.